I'm Dan Santos, and welcome to Groundwater 101. In this video, what I'm going to do is to introduce you to the basics of groundwater, which is a very important resource to us here on Cape Cod, and in particular in the town of Barnstable. So you might be asking, what gives me the expertise to talk about groundwater? Well, just to give you a brief bio on myself, I'm the Director of Public Works here in the town of Barnstable. I have been for the past 11 years. I'm a registered civil engineer in Massachusetts, where I've been working for about 35 years on primarily water resource issues, including mostly groundwater. I came to the Cape in 1990 to manage the groundwater cleanup program at what is now Joint Base Cape Cod, but formerly was the Massachusetts Military Reservation out in Falmouth and Bourne in Mashpee area, where some of the most cutting edge work on groundwater investigations and cleanup has occurred in the United States over the past almost 40 years. After that, I was a partner and principal of a water resources environmental consulting firm where we did groundwater investigations for private and municipal clients. And we did training in groundwater and water resources for states and the federal government through the Environmental Protection Agency. So that's why I'm here. I have some knowledge in the area, particularly on Cape Cod. And the purpose of this video is really to introduce the basics of groundwater, this resource we have. And in future videos, we'll likely touch on other water resources like our surface waters and our estuaries, because I think there's a need for some basic introductory information there. The town councilors and the town manager's office and myself, we've all been getting questions about groundwater, and you may have heard some of these questions or comments about groundwater contamination and the aquifer, and I'll be talking about some of these terms during this video, some definitions. What I hope to go through is several things. Groundwater definitions, what is groundwater, how we get it, why is it important? The aquifer, what the aquifer is, that's part of our definitions. We're going to talk about water supply on Cape Cod and in Barnstable, and then finally on groundwater contamination. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation on PowerPoint, which I'm going to bring up. And for the rest of this video, I'll be using the slides to speak with you, but I'll be off on the side and you can see me there speaking. So what is groundwater? Well, groundwater simply is the water that is held in the earth beneath the surface of the ground. And how does it get there? Well, groundwater is part of one of the most important ecological systems that we have on the planet, and that's called the water cycle. Water on the earth is finite. There's only so much of it. We're not creating it, we're not destroying it. It's in a cycle, and you can see here on this graphic how this works. The 90% of the Earth's water is salt water, held in the oceans. Now, 70% of the Earth is covered by oceans, you may have learned in elementary school. But because of the depth of the oceans, 90% of the Earth's water is salt, and it's in the oceans. The remaining 10% of water is held in glaciers, frozen in glaciers, is in surface waters, surface fresh waters, like lakes, ponds, and streams, in groundwater, and in our bodies even. We're mostly water. And finally, in the atmosphere. And you can see here how this cycle works. If you start in the ocean, well, because of the sun's rays and heat, the ocean evaporates. The water in the ocean evaporates. Just the water does. The salt is not included. So when that evaporation goes up into the atmosphere as condensation, that's fresh, clean water only. And that condensation gets formed into clouds and then travels over the Earth's surface and then results in rain or precipitation. That rain on land turns into runoff. So that's what runoff is the liquid water from rain that runs off the land, makes puddles, goes into rivers and streams. And then that may infiltrate, meaning it may go down into the ground surface. And then much of the rainwater, in fact, most of it does infiltrate. And you can see that here, infiltration, and it goes down into the ground, beneath the ground surface, and is held there. But groundwater moves, and groundwater moves to a point where it will discharge, and that is usually the oceans. So we have the groundwater down low here. Hopefully you can see my pointer after it's been infiltrated, moving beneath the ground surface and discharging into the ocean, where it is then evaporated, turns into condensation, and the cycle resumes. So this is the water cycle, very important ecological system on planet Earth. So let's focus on groundwater now. And if I was to cut a section of the Earth, cut down into the Earth, and we looked inside Cape Cod, say, this is here, this is what you'd see. So this surface water, we can call this Vineyard Sound. This is the ocean. Here's Cape Cod. And you'll see the land surface, and you'll see an unsaturated zone and a saturated zone. What this simply means is that below the ground surface, there are two parts. One is where all of the spaces between the geology material or the soil or the gravel or the bedrock, where all those spaces between those particles are filled with water, that's the saturated zone. It's fully saturated. There's no air. And above that is the unsaturated zone, where there is air. There may be some water that's moving down from infiltration, from precipitation down through into the groundwater, but there's more air in the unsaturated zone. And the transition between the unsaturated zone and the saturated zone is called the water table. And I'm sure you've heard that term used, the water table. That's the upper surface of the saturated zone. Now let's talk about the material that is in the soil. It can be many different types of things. It can be rock. Most geology in the world, at some point, you hit bedrock. And that's why it's called bedrock. It's the foundation of the earth. And above that, they may be many things. There can be clay, there can be sand, gravel, rock. But here on Cape Cod, if we focus on Cape Cod, it's primarily sand and gravel. Now, why is that important? Well, now we start talking about how much water is in the ground and how it moves. So the groundwater, how much water is in the ground is based on a term called porosity. You may have heard that before. Porosity is basically how much space there is between the material that the ground is made up of. So if it's boulders, then there'd be a lot of space between the boulders because they can't get that close. But if it was sand packs very tightly together, there's not a lot of space between those grains of sand. So the sand would be less porous, the boulders would be more porous. Let me give you a different example. Say you took an aquarium, home hobbyist aquarium fish tank, and you filled it with softballs. So you can picture that. And the softballs, where they touch, they all pack in there, but they only pack so much. And because of the size of them, there's lots of area between them. And so if you fill that tank with water, you could put quite a bit of water, say a gallon of water, before it would overflow the tank. Now, envision that same fish tank aquarium with marbles in it. Well, marbles are much smaller, and because of that, they can pack much tightly together. So if you took that same gallon of water and poured it into the aquarium with marbles, it would overflow because there's not as much room available for the water. Well, the ground surface is the same thing. So where we have, if the ground beneath us is bedrock, the only place the water can be stored, as you can see on the left here of this graphic, is in the cracks within the bedrock. And there are always cracks. So water is stored in bedrock. Not as much as other materials, but on Cape Cod, we have primarily sand and gravel. And that sand and gravel can retain water. Another analogy is a sponge. If you take a sponge, you can fill it with water and hold it, and the water may not come out. But if you squeeze it, the water comes out freely. That's because you've compressed that material, and the water that's held in the pore spaces is released. So that's porosity, how much space there is for water in the material. The other important term is permeability. Now, these are certainly related, but they are different. Permeability relates to how well water can transmit through the material. And that's related to how well those spaces between the sand and gravel or the rocks are connected. So if they're connected really well, then the material is considered very permeable and can flow easily. Now, again, relating it back to Cape Cod, we have a very porous and permeable sand and gravel aquifer. Now, an aquifer simply is an area that is able to produce groundwater freely. In other words, we can extract the water from this geologic material. And because we can do that and we can use it freely for the uses that we want to make of it, that's considered an aquifer. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency calls aquifers that supply more than 50% of the fresh water supply in an area a sole source aquifer. And on Cape Cod, actually, the sole source aquifer provides 100% of our drinking water. Every town on the Cape gets its water supply from the groundwater beneath the Cape surface. And that water is supplied by groundwater wells that extract the groundwater. Except in Falmouth, there's one surface water reservoir that supplies water. But that reservoir is supplied by groundwater. So how did this material get here? Why do we have this aquifer, and why does it behave the way it does? Well, it's basically because of the last glacial age, or the last glaciation, which was about 15,000 years ago. So the glaciers moved from the north because the Earth was in a cooling period, and they moved very slowly over millions of years more south, and they moved further and further south. And about 15,000 years ago, as the Earth's temperature warmed up, the glacier stopped. And it stopped here at Cape Cod. And if you look at a map of the Northeast, the glacier stopped in a line that follows Long Island, Block Island, and Cape Cod. That's where the glaciers stopped. And when the glacier stopped and the Earth's surface was warming up, it started to melt. Well, the glaciers, as they moved over the mountains in New Hampshire, they wore them down. That's why our mountains in the Northeast are much smaller than they are out west in the Rockies, for example, because they've been worn down by glaciers. And that material, in like a conveyor belt operation, gets moved down with the glacier to its endpoint. And as it started melting, all that material that was ground up and carried by the glacier melted off and moved down south beneath the glacier and became Cape Cod. It's built over the bedrock, as I mentioned earlier, and that's why the Mid-Cape, where the Mid-Cape Highway is, that's generally the highest point of the Cape, particularly on the Upper Cape and the Mid-Cape, and that's where the glacier ended. So the larger material fell out there. So there's lots of boulders. Sometimes you see them called glacial erratics. These are huge boulders that that can be found if you're digging a foundation, or you might see them in the woods. But as you move towards the southern beaches, it's a very fine gravel and then a fine sand. So this is the source of the aquifer that we have on Cape Cod. So here's an example that you may relate to. Anyone who's gone to the beach as a kid or even as an adult and dug a hole in the beach, it fills with water. Well, the reason that is what we were just talking about. All that sand is filled with water beneath a certain point. So what I show you here is the water you see, that's the water table, just like in the previous graphic. The sand above that is the unsaturated zone. So it may be damp, but there's no water that flows from it. And then below that water surface, all the spaces between the sand is completely saturated with water. So this is the concept of the water table. Here's another section we cut through Cape Cod, say in the Sandwich and Falmouth area. We cut through and we look at the Cape facing east. So what you see here is, here's the land surface, but beneath the land surface is our fresh groundwater. And that groundwater, this is the aquifer I referred to. This is all sand and gravel down to bedrock. And our aquifer is about, it varies, but it's about 200 feet thick between the top of the land surface and the bedrock below. So we have 200 feet of sand and gravel that holds clean, fresh groundwater. Now, under the ocean, there's groundwater too, but it's salty groundwater or saline. And there's an interface here on both sides at Cape Cod Bay and on the Atlantic Ocean side or the Sound side, where fresh groundwater discharges to the ocean as part of the water cycle we talked about earlier. So our Cape Cod aquifer, here's a plan view of the Cape, has 6 lenses. And the reason they say that, these are distinct areas of this underground aquifer, the groundwater, that don't communicate with each other. It's considered one aquifer because it's one geologic system, the sand and gravel. But because of inlets and rivers, these are separate units. So if something happened here in the Monomoy lens to contaminate the groundwater, it wouldn't move to the Sagamore lens, which Barnstable is part of. So these lenses are, if you think about with a dropper, an eyedropper, put a drop of water on a table. It's like a bubble. And that's what these lenses are. They're like a bubble of water beneath the ground surface. And let me show you how this works, what you're looking at. I don't know if you have familiarity with a topographic map and how to read a topo map, but a topographic map tells you what the land surface looks like, where there are hills and valleys. Well, a groundwater map does exactly the same thing. And what we're looking at here are these lenses, and that's the tan color, and these areas of lines. These are all groundwater contours, or areas where the elevation is, the groundwater elevation is below the surface. And to show you how this works, so the previous slide, we were looking at this map view. But if we cut into the earth and turn it on its side to see the side view, this is what we're looking at. So this applies both for the ground surface in a topographic map or for the groundwater in a groundwater map for the subsurface. So this underground is considered a groundwater mound. So if we go back to the last slide, these lenses are mounds of groundwater, like that little drop on the desk. Think of them as enormous drops of water. So the water isn't flat at one level beneath the ground surface, but it's mounded and it moves from that mound in all directions. And the way it moves is perpendicular to these lines. So it wants to move towards water for discharging in the water cycle. And the reason it moves is because water moves from a high point to a low point. Water seeks its own level. That's why we have liquid levels, because water's good at seeking its own level. The ocean surface is completely flat and level. Ponds are completely flat and level. So if a drop of water falls on our Sagamore Lens mound, if it falls on the north side, it's going to flow to the north to Cape Cod Bay. If it falls on the south side of the mound, just think about rolling downhill. If you put a marble on a mountain and had a north, south, east, and west, if you put that marble on the south side, it's going to roll down the south face. Well, the water behaves exactly the same. It flows from the high point to the low point, with the lowest point being sea level. And so it flows out into Vineyard Sound or Nantucket Sound. It flows towards the Bass River. It flows towards the Cape Cod Canal, and it flows towards Cape Cod Bay. So this is important to know when we're protecting groundwater and trying to understand where contamination might be. We can know where to look and how it's going to behave. Now, groundwater moves very slowly. And here's an idea on the Cape how groundwater moves. So if we look here in Bourne and Sandwich, this is the area of our Sagamore Lens and our mound. You can see that at the top of the mound, so a drop of rain water that fell in the middle of the Cape, where this very bright blue area is, that would take more than 100 years to travel to the ocean. But a drop of water that fell, say, in Centerville, would take close to the ocean, would take on the order of 10 or less years. So groundwater on the Cape moves a little less than 1 foot per day towards the ocean. So that's important information as well. It helps us understand, again, when we're dealing with contamination in the groundwater, we can predict by knowing the direction it moves because of our groundwater contour map, and how fast it's going to get there because we know our times of travel because it's been measured by our friends at the U.S. Geological Survey. Now, how do we get drinking water out of our aquifer and the groundwater? It's a very simple process, and we use what's called wells. We have two kinds of wells. We have supply wells where we pump groundwater out to utilize it. We also have monitoring wells that allow us to peek into the aquifer and to get information from it based on, we can get the elevation of the groundwater or the water table. And if we put 3 monitoring wells in the ground and we measure the water table in each of those, we can determine in what direction the water's flowing, because it's going to flow from the highest point, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, to the lowest point. So it'll flow from the well that has the highest elevation to the well with the lowest elevation. But focusing on our drinking water, a drinking water well, what it originally was what you think of from storybooks or picture books, is a well was dug in the ground by hand, and it was a big hole in the ground, and you put a bucket down there and you cranked it up, and that's how you got water. Today's well is not much different than that, but we use pipes instead. So you can see here the pipe. The pipe is pressed into the ground. Now we want to get it well below the water table. And the reason for that is the water table fluctuates. It fluctuates month to month based on rainwater. So you've heard the term we're in a drought. So in a drought, we don't get as much recharge to the aquifer. Recharge is simply filling the aquifer back up with rainwater. So if we have a low rainwater year, we're not going to fill as much of the aquifer back up than we would if we had a high groundwater year. We get about 48 inches of rain here on Cape Cod on average. And on average, about half of that, 24 inches, goes back into the ground. The rest goes into surface waters and evaporates off because we have ponds and lakes and rivers. And as part of that water cycle, that water gets evaporated. So we put our well in, and at the bottom of this pipe is open with a screen, like your screen door, wrapped around it. And that keeps any fine sand or silt from getting in there and clogging the well. So at the bottom of the well, there's a screen, and then we put a pump in there, and we extract the groundwater. And you can see here the groundwater flow is being intercepted. And you can see how the water table dips at the well because we're drawing water out faster than it can be replaced because of the permeability. So the water is reluctant to move as fast as we want to pull it, so it draws it down. So as managers of the system, we have to make sure that we're not taking water out faster than it can be replaced, or else we're going to run the well dry. So that's an important consideration that all the water departments across the Cape have to think about. And we work with the Department of Environmental Protection to make sure we're not drawing down the aquifer to the point where we can't use it any longer. And we have to watch out. See, if this well was put closer to this stream, it's possible that pumping the well could draw down the level of the water in the stream, or if it was a lake, make the lake level go down. So we have to be careful about that. So I'd like to talk about groundwater contamination now and connect a lot of these concepts that we've been talking about. So groundwater can be contaminated by the activities on the ground surface. And so it's actually very easy to contaminate our groundwater because we live above our aquifer. Everything that's done on Cape Cod, the roads that are built, the buildings that are built, all of the uses we have the potential to contaminate the groundwater. And so some primary examples are landfills or dumps. You can see here on the left, where every town used to have a dump. And a lot of these things that went on, we didn't understand groundwater science as well as we do now. We didn't understand that burying trash could contaminate the groundwater 100 feet down. Well, it does. And here's how that works is once we bury the trash underground, we think about infiltration. So rainwater falls on that trash or that landfill. The rainwater infiltrates and it percolates down through all that trash. And that water picks up what's ever in there. So if there's contamination in the landfill, someone buried oil drums or gasoline or many things can cause this. PFAS more recently, that then travels down beneath the landfill, down into the water table and into the groundwater, and then it moves in the groundwater. And it moves in what are called plumes. And the way to think of this is think about a smokestack, like at the Canal Electric plant when that used to be running. So that smokestack puts out smoke. And that smoke that goes out, that's a plume. And that smoke follows the air currents. So you can see that plume of smoke moving in whatever direction the wind's blowing. it's the same thing with groundwater. That plume of contamination in the water moves with the groundwater. Now, if you have a drinking water well that happens to be in the area where that plume is, you're going to suck that plume up and thus the contamination into your drinking water well. And this was first identified in Falmouth related to Joint Base Cape Cod back in the 1970s, where they were getting high levels of nitrogen nitrates in the groundwater drinking water well, and they couldn't figure out how that was happening. And through lots of study and many years of analysis, they realized that the wastewater treatment plant at the base was discharging onto the land surface, and rainwater was creating this contamination, which was flowing right to the well. Now, what's important to know is that once the contaminants are in the groundwater, they don't disperse completely throughout the aquifer. So if you put, well, for example, let's use the base. If the base landfill contaminated some groundwater in a plume, it stays together in that plume. And it all depends on the chemicals that are involved. So it gets very complicated, but it has to do with the chemical solubility in water. In other words, how much of the chemical can dissolve in the water. So take a glass of water, and if you have salt, you put some salt in that water, it dissolves. But at some point, it won't dissolve anymore. The salt will build up on the bottom. So that's addressing the solubility of salt in water. It only can take so much. And think about salad dressing, right? Oil and water, the adage, oil and water don't mix. And that's because of the solubility of olive oil in water is very low. And so the chemicals are just like that. So some chemicals dissolve very quickly and in large amounts, and we end up with larger plumes. Some chemicals aren't soluble as much in water, and they don't contaminate the water. They will actually, some things will remain and float on top of the water table, which is not necessarily a bad thing if it's not contaminating the water. So other sources of contamination are septic tanks, and we know that here in Barnstable because of our comprehensive wastewater management plan. Those septic tanks are contributing nitrogen to the groundwater via these processes I've been talking about. And because we know now that groundwater moves to the coasts, that nitrogen-laden groundwater moves to our coastal estuaries where it over fertilizes them. Nitrogen is a fertilizer and creates the issues that we have with contamination in our estuaries. So the point of the groundwater, the comprehensive wastewater management plan is to eliminate those sources of nitrogen to those estuaries so that we can improve them over time and bring those ecosystems back to what they may have been in the past as productive parts of our environs to support shellfish and finfish and all the recreation uses we have. So that's how septic tanks contaminate our aquifer. Runoff from the land is another huge source. So whatever we put on the land, for example, if we're putting pesticides or fertilizer on our gardens or on our lawns, if we over fertilize, then the extra fertilizer gets dragged by rainwater again down into the groundwater and can contaminate areas of groundwater. And here in Barnstable, some of our biggest concerns, other than the nitrogen from wastewater, recently have been the PFAS compounds, and there's hundreds of them, but there's certain ones that we focus on that are coming from places like the Fire Training Academy that the county ran off Mary Dunn Road. So for many years, they were training firefighters, which we have to do, but they were using foams that contain these PFAS compounds. And those foams just washed off into the pond there and into the groundwater and created one of these plumes of contaminants that has now made its way to our Mar well field, and where we have pumped this water with PFAS in the past into our system. Now, we identified that back in 2015, and the Environmental Protection Agency realized this was harmful to humans, and they stopped us from putting that in our system. So as soon as we found out about this in 2015, we shut down those wells that had PFAS in them, and we installed treatment systems. And I'll get to that in just a moment. But as managers, it's important that we protect the areas around our wells. So here's a map showing the wellhead, and that's what a well is called, well or wellhead, protection areas on Cape Cod. And the green dots are the actual drinking water wells, the municipal public drinking water wells. And the beige color are the protection areas. So we know, we were able to calculate what area around a well contributes water to that well. And that's what these beige areas are. So these are all the areas of water that go to the well. So if you put a septic system in one of these areas of the beige, the nitrogen from that septic system is going to go into the well. If you put a septic system out here in the white, it's not going, it may go out to the coast, but it's not going to go into one of these wells. So here in Barnstable, these are what are called these zones of contribution to our drinking water wells. And you can see, and these are areas that we want to protect, because we know that anything that happens on the ground in these areas that gets to the groundwater is going to go into a well. And so we have regulations, zoning regulations, that help us to protect these areas. And this is the town of Barnstable's zoning overlay map. And these are areas, the WP stands for Wellhead Protection area. So that's the Wellhead Protection Overlay Zone. And then, which is around the well. And then the groundwater protection, the GP, the green area, what we've done is calculate an area that would provide water to these wells within 5 years, based on knowing how fast groundwater moves. And so we've protected these areas, and we don't allow certain uses in these areas. For example, we don't allow the installation of landfills, and we don't allow wastewater treatment plants to be put into these areas, or salt storage, or allow businesses that do dry cleaning. Now, there may be those businesses and functions that have been grandfathered and are in these areas, but we do have monitoring to understand if there's contamination. So throughout the town, we have monitoring wells that both the town monitors and the U.S. Geological Survey monitors. And from time to time, we're testing our water quality, and particularly with our water systems. So we have 4 water systems in town. The Hyannis water system, which is run by the Department of Public Works, which is owned by the town. And then the COMM water system, Cotuit water system, and the Barnstable water system are all independent municipal entities associated with fire districts, and they run the water systems for those towns, and they all have monitoring wells. So they're always monitoring the water that's coming to their wells, but also the water that's in their wells. And that's how we identified in the Hyannis water system, the Mar wells, the PFAS. Once it was identified by our regulatory agencies that this was something we have to look for. And we monitor all these water sources for many, many, many chemicals, salt, volatile organic compounds, chlorine, gasoline, high levels of nitrogen. So all these things, lead, for example, that have contaminant levels by the Department of Environmental Protection, we monitor. And if we find those things in our wells, We have to shut the wells down until we can put treatment systems on them. And so here's an example of a treatment system on the Hyannis water system. And this is related to the PFAS contamination. And these are carbon filtration units. And it turns out that the type of PFAS that's in the groundwater that we're pumping out of the aquifer at the Well field, which is off Yarmouth Road on the Yarmouth border, contains PFAS that can be treated with carbon. This is the same system as I used the aquarium analogy earlier. If you have a fish tank, if you've seen one, they have carbon filters in them. That's how they keep fish tanks clean, and it's the same exact material. The carbon attracts the contaminants and holds it, and clean water comes out the other end. So we're able to treat our water so that there is zero PFAS left coming out of the pipe going into our system. And we monitor this constantly. So we're able to remove all of that material. We also have other types of treatment systems that remove other material, and we will continue to upgrade these systems to improve our water quality. We're planning to build another treatment system in the Straightway area for a number of contaminants and to improve our water quality there. And the Barnstable Water District is also designing a water treatment system as we speak to deal with this new PFAS contamination. There's been some recent concern about electrical substations on our aquifer. Electrical substations have been on Cape Cod and on our aquifer for 100 years. It's an essential utility. I'm not aware of any substation that has contaminated drinking water source on Cape Cod ever. I'm not aware. Doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but if it had, I think we'd be aware of it. The material in substations is not hazardous, like it's mineral oil, in particularly the new substations. And it's a highly refined petroleum project, which is not very soluble in water. That's a good thing. And it is very, let's say it's thick. It's not like water. It's thick like oil. So it doesn't move very quickly. So if there was a spill of mineral oil, that could be dug up and cleaned up very quickly. It wouldn't move down into the ground surface quickly because it's thick. It wouldn't dissolve because it's not soluble like some other contaminants and go down into the groundwater table. Plus, all of our new requirements are that we install containment systems for substations so that if there was a catastrophic release of transformer oil, and this is a very, very rare occurrence, then we could capture that oil and it wouldn't get into the environment. Certainly, anything like this is of concern, and we make sure that we engineer systems that can contain and mitigate issues if we have to live with certain parts of infrastructure in our environment. Our roads go over our aquifer. We can't eliminate all the roads. We can't eliminate the construction. We have to live with these things in our, in our modern society, but we have the engineering ability to contain and mitigate any potential threats. But given that, we want to make sure that we're not being imprudent and just allowing any use, but it's a understanding fully our responsibility with protection of our resources. That concludes my Groundwater 101 presentation. I hope you found it informative. I encourage you to help to protect our groundwater by being responsible about what products you use in your home and what you may do on your property. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Again, I'm Dan Santos. I'm the Director of Public Works. My email is daniel.santos@town.barnstable.ma.us, but you can find it on the town's website or call Public Works. I'm easy to find. And feel free to reach out with any questions you have or ideas that you have about additional knowledge you'd like to have or see about our aquifer. In future presentations, we'll deal with more about drinking water and our other water resources like our ponds and rivers and our estuaries. So thank you for watching.